Welcome to All Those Kings. This is actually All Those Kings Part 2. I'm John Moore, and we're going to be talking for the next several weeks about the divided kingdom period. We're going to be talking about the kings following Solomon and the breakup of the kingdom of Israel and its decline and eventual destruction. Question is, why should we bother reading the book of Kings? It's confusing. If you've ever read it, it says so-and-so became king during the third year of the king of so-and-so of Israel and Judah, and back and forth. And there are people who simply bypass the books because it's complicated. But there are several reasons why we should study the book of Kings and kind of as a parallel study the book of 2 Chronicles. There's a difference between the two, and there are contradictions, and we'll talk about that probably next time. But one of the reasons is that this is a book that Jesus read. When he talked about people and said, we have so-and-so did this and so-and-so did that, he was looking at the Old Testament, and the people that are referred to in the Old Testament are in the book of Kings, and we need to study that. Another reason is that historically, this is probably the most important apologetic book in the Bible. Some of you have been to classes where we've talked about apologetics, in other words, confirmation of the history of Israel. And this particular book has people mentioned in it who are mentioned in Assyrian documents, Babylonian documents. We have dates for those, and we can link those back to the Bible. And that's where we get the chronology, the timing of all of the events leading from the death of Solomon up to Christ. We get that from the book of Kings. A third reason is it's fun. These are a lot of nasty people. We have an iconic woman, for example, in the book of Kings, the iconic evil woman. Who's that? Jezebel. Of course, there are two iconic evil women. Who's the other one most often mentioned as an evil woman? Delilah. So she comes right before that in the book of Judges. So there are lots of good reasons for studying the book of Kings, and basically, the divided kingdom period ran from 930 BC down to 586. Solomon died in 930. That's a good date. We know that. We can confirm it, and it's solid. And Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. That's a good date. We can confirm it, and it's solid. So in that particular window of time, we have all of these different kings, and the question is, when did they do their thing? When you open your study Bibles and they have those absolutely bizarre, terrible timelines with all the little numbers and arrows, absolutely unintelligible, but those dates have all been calculated from the book of Kings. There are two major players who start things off. There's Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Rehoboam being the son of Solomon, Jeroboam being upper class nobility of some sort, not of the line of David. He's not of the royal family. And from Jeroboam, we have a line of kings, not his sons. His son took the throne and was assassinated by a man who took the throne, and his son was assassinated. And you work your way down through the kings that followed Jeroboam, and it was chaotic down to the time of the destruction of Samaria by the Assyrians in about 720. We'll be talking about all these things. Rehoboam, on the other hand, who was a son of Solomon and of the Davidic line, gave rise to a line of kings who ruled down to the destruction of Jerusalem. There was one small period of time where a pagan woman sat on the throne for 7 years, and we'll talk about that as well. Then came the destruction of Jerusalem. But there are some other very important players during this period of time. We talk about them, but we never study them too much. There's Ahab and his successor Jehu. These are the two fellows that are in the Assyrian records. We actually have a picture of Jehu on an Assyrian inscription. We have a picture of an Israelite king kneeling in front of the king of Assyria. It's the first picture we have of somebody at this period of time, and we'll be talking about them. Hezekiah, very important figure. He's the guy that built the tunnel everybody's heard about, Hezekiah's tunnel. And later on, during the destruction of Jerusalem, we have Josiah and his sons. Those are those four kings following the death of Josiah, one for 3 months, one for 11 years, one for 3 months, one for 11 years. Very confusing. but easily understood, and that's when Babylon destroyed the city of Jerusalem and carried everybody off into exile. So this is what happens during that time, and we actually have a couple of the major prophets. Elijah and Elisha were doing their prophecy up in the northern kingdom at the time of Ahab and Jehu. Elijah is certainly the most important prophet to the Jewish believers of the time of Christ. They kept asking if John the Baptist was Elijah reincarnated or returned. Well, this is that Elijah. We'll talk about him. And then during the time of Hezekiah, we have Isaiah, who obviously is one of the greatest. And then we have Jeremiah during the time of Josiah. So these are very important figures, and we need to understand these. We're introduced into one other prophet at that time, a young fellow by the name of Daniel, who's carried off into exile and then remained in Babylon for his entire life, writing the documents of the book of Daniel. I wanted to point out one other thing. The international circumstances, the geopolitical conditions at this time were chaotic. There were lots of things happening outside of the kingdom of Israel, and unfortunately, Israel broke into two parts at the very worst possible time. They weakened themselves tremendously at a time when outside powers were coming into their own strength, and of course that made Israel more susceptible to its destruction. Following the time of Solomon, a small group, a community of people, a small culture known as Arameans, rose to its greatest strength, and we read about that in the Bible. During the time of Ahab, the Arameans were always attacking. They were up in the area around Damascus in modern Syria today. However, in the 800s and 700s, a superpower rose out in Mesopotamia, finally came to their greatest strength, a very predatory, militaristic, horrific people. They loved to torture and destroy, and they were known as Assyrians. And they held reign for the next couple of hundred years, but shortly before the death of Josiah, a group of people took over the Assyrian kingdom, destroyed it. They were the Babylonians, and then ultimately were able to conquer Jerusalem and carry them off into exile. So lots of things going on historically, lots of things going on theologically, and we'll be talking about all of these over the next several weeks. As an introduction, it's helpful to know what the land looked like. This is Google Earth. It's the eastern end of the Mediterranean, and you can see Egypt, that little green patch off to the left, and then this particular part of the world is broken by a huge crack. Two tectonic plates moving past each other, and it creates this groove that runs from Turkey down to the Serengeti Plain called the Great Rift. It's the deepest place on the surface of the earth. And down in this very narrow, sometimes just a couple of miles wide, sometimes 15 miles wide, down in this deep groove, you have the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and the Dead Sea. This is the division between Israel and Jordan today. It's a political division. Now, when the Israelites went to Egypt, and incidentally, who were the Israelites? They were the descendants of Jacob. Jacob was given a name, Israel. He fought a heavenly being. The heavenly being said, from now on, you'll be called Israel. And everywhere in the book of Genesis that you read the word Israel, it's referring to the man. It's not referring to the nation or the people. And the descendants of every man, according to the custom of the time, was to call them an ite. You have Israelites. They could have been Jacobites if he hadn't had his name changed. At the time of the movement into Egypt to join Joseph, Israel, as a man, had 12 sons, and he had a whole lot of grandsons, and we are told by name how many of those went to Egypt with him, and we're told there were a total of 67, including Israel. And then you have Joseph, Manasseh, and Ephraim, his two sons in Egypt. So you have 70 males, plus women, daughters and wives, and you have the various servants and so on. So this was probably a migrating tribe of just about 300 or 400 people. Those are the Israelites at that time. That's how many went into Egypt. When they came back out, they were a much larger group, of course, and they had settled in a place called Goshen, which is it's the choice property. And when they left, they traveled for a while. They remained at a place called Kadesh, We don't know exactly where that is, but it's assumed to be in the Sinai Peninsula, as you see there on the map. And then after the generation that refused to enter Canaan and engage the Canaanites in battle, after they were allowed to die, and we're told that was 40 years, but it might be a generation or might be a sufficient period of time. We're not quite sure how to interpret the 40s that show up in the Bible all the time. But what they did, the people that entered the people that entered Canaan were a second generation. All the older folks had died. Anyone over the age of 19 was allowed to die in the desert. Anybody under the age of 19 wasn't in the military. They were allowed to mature. People born during those 40 years, babies coming out of Egypt, all of those had grown up. So we now had a second group, and they traveled along the route of the Exodus to the east side of the rift, went down into the rift, set up their camp on the plains of Moab at the north end of the Dead Sea, with Jericho 8 miles away. From the edge of the river to Jericho is 8 miles. You could see it. The Israelites could see the people of Jericho, and the people of Jericho could see the Israelites with the river between them. They probably had their own guards and watchmen along the way, and then when the Israelite army started to move, everybody on the western side went into Jericho and shut the doors. The Israelites destroyed the Canaanite armies and established the right to remain in Israel, but it would appear from the book of Judges that they continued to live their semi-nomadic lifestyle because they didn't begin to build Israelite cities until about 1100 BC. Archaeologically, we find that they didn't leave any remains for about 200 years, but the Bible tells us we had the various semi-nomadic tribes helping each other out independently. They had no supervision, no government above them. Now, something happened around 1200 BC that changed all of that. And what changed that was, at this point, a little bit uncertain. I would argue that it was a major climatic change. Not global warming, it probably was global cooling, maybe related to an explosion of an airburst of a meteorite, similar to what is soon going to be published as having destroyed what is soon going to be identified publicly as the city of Sodom by Dr. Steve Collins. At any rate, Canaan was located, as you see there, but they were surrounded by three major cultures: the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, and people up in Turkey, various cultures up there. At that time, it was the Hittites. And what happened around 1200 BC is all three of those cultures collapsed. It's called the end of the Bronze Age. Archaeologists have ignored it for years because they can't really explain it, although I think we can now. But all three of those cultures were focused on Canaan because the region of Canaan, this narrow little strip of land with desert on one side and ocean on the other, controlled the trade routes. And whoever controlled Canaan controlled the economy of the world at that time. But the Mesopotamian culture had gone into decline, and the Egyptian culture had gone into decline. The Hittite culture up in Turkey was actually burned out of existence in one generation. All of this happening around 1200 BC. Again, my theory would be that it was some kind of a major climatic change that caused the agriculture to decline. The cities couldn't be supported, and everything deteriorated internationally. But at any rate, what that allowed was the Canaanite people to celebrate some independence, and you have all these tiny little kingdoms being able to have their day in the sun. Tiny little kingdoms like Moabites, Edomites, Phoenicians, Arameans, and of course, Israelites. What group is not in there? No Philistines. There were no Philistines at the arrival of the Israelites into Canaan, and actually the Philistines didn't show up for 200 years. Now, what happened then was that there was, at the same time, everything else collapsed. There was a culture up in the Aegean known as Mycenaeans. These are the descendants of the Iliad and the Odyssey. These are the descendants of Ulysses and Agamemnon and Menelaus. And what happened was around 1200 BC, they were driven out of the Aegean by a group from the north. We think that it's at this point believed to be a group of people called Dorians that very warlike, and they drove out the Mycenaeans. The Greek culture of that area collapsed for 400 years and entered into what they call the Dark Ages and didn't really revive until the 700s. And then we have the rise into the so-called Golden Age of Greece. But the Mycenaeans were driven out, and they took to their ships, all of the various tribes that were linked together, took to their ships with their women and their children and their elderly, and traveled out all over the Mediterranean, became known as the Sea Peoples. And a group of these Sea Peoples traveled to Cyprus, took over Cyprus, and used that as a launching pad, basically. And a group of about 6 tribes traveled down the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean, looting and sacking as they went, destroying all the Canaanite cities along the trade routes. They got stopped in Egypt about 1176. We have a huge relief on one of the temples showing the battle between the Egyptians and these Sea Peoples. And they were turned around and they went back up the coast, and they settled there and are known to us as Philistines, having gone back to all of the cities they just destroyed, and they rebuilt them as Philistine cities. So they finally appeared, and if you look at just the land of Israel, you have the Exodus coming up the eastern side of the Great Rift, crossing over, conquering basically the Canaanite armies, and then establishing themselves primarily in the hill country. They were given allotments down along the coast, but many of them had Canaanite cities. We read about the Danites, for example, who were unable to conquer their territory. The Israelites had remained largely in the hill country until about 1100 BC. And then they started, this is a couple of hundred years after the Exodus, they started building houses and towns that we can identify as uniquely Israelite, and they began to spread down the foothills. Meanwhile, the Philistines show up, and they conquered again the area along the coast and established what is referred to as the land of the Philistines. Now, obviously, they're both, the Philistines are spreading inland into the foothills. The Israelites are spreading westward down into the foothills. And the two territories actually came together. During the time of Samson, you have an Israelite town literally just a couple of miles from a Philistine town. And it's inevitable that there's going to be conflict eventually. This is the region in the foothills, for example, where Samson was located. Samson actually did his carousing and his entertainment in Philistine cities, so there was some type of a pleasant relationship between the two, even though we are told that the Philistines had control. Samson even wanted a Philistine wife, and the Philistine family was willing to accept an Israelite, so you have to know that relations at that time were comfortable to some degree. However, with the death of Samson's wife, what was her name? And it wasn't, we don't know her name. She was played by Angela Lansbury in the movie. We aren't given her name, unfortunately. But at any rate, Samson seems to have triggered the series of events that led to the military conflict between the two countries. One of the neat things with modern archaeology and the records that we can see in computer simulations and so on, we now know what Samson probably looked like. And I wanted to show you a picture of the reconstruction of what he would have looked like. Actually, everybody in this room, I'm sure, knows who that is. A younger generation has never seen the movie. I do have to make a little comment. My wife, as a high school girl, was madly in love with Victor Mature. He was the He-Man of the day, and so she thought he was something else. Now, we are able to reconstruct what Delilah looked like also, and so I thought I'd show you her. Anybody know who that is? That's Hedy Lamarr, right. And I get the biggest kick out of this particular picture because if you take a look at what's in her hand, she's got a little apple or something. I think probably reflecting back to the story of Eve, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, but this is one of the greatest Bible movies ever made, and I just love it. Okay. what happened was that following the time of Samson, active military involvement developed between the Israelites and the Philistines. They attacked the Israelites in 1075 in a major battle in which the Ark of the Covenant was captured. And it was eventually returned because the Philistines had major problems as a result. They had plague, they had disease. It said they had tumors, but if you read an accurate translation of the word that's translated as tumors in most of our Bibles, if you read it in the Jewish Publication Society, which is Jewish scholars looking at the Hebrew and translating it, they translate it as hemorrhoids. So not only did the Philistines get tumors and their gods fall down, but they were all afflicted with hemorrhoids, and so they brought the ark back. Then there was a generation later, another major battle, probably about 1050, and the Israelites at that point realized that a militaristic culture such as the Philistines, highly militaristic, well-trained, they were well experienced because they had fought their way into the country and continued to do so. They realized they needed some supervision, and they went to Samuel, who was their leader at the time, their theological and at the same time their political leader, and they said, "We need a king." And he said, "No, you don't." And he said, "Yeah, we do." And the Lord said, if they want a king, give them a king. And what happened was they anointed a man named Saul to be their first king. He was a Benjamite, a despised little tribe that had almost been wiped out 2 generations earlier. And he apparently was a very good military king, but he disobeyed the Lord during his reign and was told that his sons would not follow him to the throne. And they anointed another individual who would follow him, a young man by the name of David, who didn't become king for another 15 years. Now, I wanted to show you this, just as an aside, showing you some of the problems inherent in biblical translation and interpretation. There was a period of time where the Bible was considered inerrant and inspired. I would still argue that it was inspired, but it is no longer inerrant because errors and contradictions have been introduced into the text over the thousands of years that it's been transmitted down to us with its translations. The original Bible was inerrant. I accept that. In fact, I argue that. But we do have conflicts and problems occasionally. The Bible here says that Saul was 30 years old and he reigned for 42 years. The problem is we have no text anywhere in all of the copies of old Bibles. We have no text of this passage that gives us the 30 and the 40. These are calculated dates, and they fit historically. They fit with the material that we understand historically, but that's not biblical. I mean, that's not textual. If you look at the JPS again, the Jewish Publication Society, here's how they render that passage. He was blank years old, and it says he reigned for 2 years, which is absurd. Now, they would argue that he wasn't king for that entire period of time that he was in charge, but to just render it as 2 years, I think, is incorrect. So these are the kinds of things that you stumble across from time to time, and it in no way disqualifies the authenticity or the historicity of the Bible. It just shows that we still have things to learn. Okay, Samuel, after Saul disobeyed the Lord and refused to wipe out the Amalekites, he refused to kill Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and so he was told basically that your line will be ended with your reign, because he reigned for another 15 years. But it says Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed David in the presence of his brothers. I've included that illustration because I think it's probably not too inaccurate, and it kind of gives you a sense of what was going on. David was a shepherd boy. Now, we know what he looked like also from a major statue, and oops, we're in church. I'm sorry, we have to. Just as perhaps an inappropriate aside, David is not an Israelite in this statue. Michelangelo did not render him Jewish. He has not been operated on as a boy. But that's one statue there. Here's another one that's kind of fun. This was given to Jerusalem about 2000 when they were celebrating what was theoretically the 3,000 years since David, which is pretty close. That's a small statue about this big, and you can see he's wearing his Bedouin shepherding outfit. But it's kind of a fun little statue, and that particular pose, watch it very carefully as you look at this photograph. That's an actual photograph of an Arab shepherd boy, probably taken in the 1930s, and that's probably not too far from what David might have looked like at the time. You have your sheep scattered around out there. Shepherding was the job for the boys, the young people, or the bottom structure of society. It was not a respected job. It was primarily the boys. And so we have a young shepherd boy, and I wanted to take just a moment as we work our way through this. I wanted to present you with the thought that what David did with Goliath not only is historically accurate, but quite possibly could have been the only way that Goliath could have been defeated. It's a very, very good story, and yet it's one of the ones that is used to disqualify the Bible. Bible critics will say, 15-year-old boy could never have defeated a huge trained Philistine warrior. And what I'm saying is none of the Israelite warriors could have defeated Goliath, only a boy like David, with his faith and with his skills as a slinger. You can see videos, if you search, showing people with a sling actually knocking birds out of the sky as they fly by. Slingers can be very, very accurate, and David would have been highly skilled. He was a boy sitting out there week after week, day and night, with his flocks. No iPads, couldn't read, no books. They had to do something, and he had a sling, which was a military weapon, incidentally, easily made by non-military people, a little pouch with a couple of strings, but they actually had slingers in all armies. And so he and the other shepherd boys probably threw stones at each other, like young boys do, and at birds, and he would have been highly skilled, without question. So David went up to Goliath in the field and said, "I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." And then it goes on to say that he reached into his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. Then he stepped over, pulled out Goliath's sword, decapitated him, and ended the battle right there. Now, this is, I think, a pretty accurate representation of how it might have played out. The Bible says that Goliath was 6.5 cubits. That would be, a cubit is basically 18 inches generally, and a hand is half a cubit. So they measured, the original measurements way back when were the foreman's forearm and half his forearm. And that, if you use Israelite measurements, that averages out to about over 9 feet. However, the Mesopotamian cubit was only 15 inches, and that measures out to a man that's a little over 7 feet tall. I would argue that Goliath easily could have been 7 feet tall. You look at some of our basketball players today, they're 7'3", 7'4", they weigh 300 pounds, they're huge. He would be referred to as a giant. And then here's the average Israelite was about 5 feet 4 inches, according to anthropologists today. So here you have this little boy going out there against a man who's been trained, and we are told that he had on a helmet, and he had a huge shield and his chest plate. He had greaves on his legs. This is Aegean. This is from the Greek areas. He had a huge spear, and he also had a sword, which was still in the scabbard. Now, the one part of his body that is unprotected is his face. And if Goliath was using his weapons, he had a range of about 6 or 7 feet around him. The average soldier would step in and they would engage with swords or whatever. But if David stayed back at 10 or 15 feet, he could send a stone into the face of Goliath and stun him, and he would fall. I mean, it's a very believable scenario. The same thing happened, I use this as an example. So many of you would remember a baseball player named Herb Score. He got hit in the face with a baseball back in the 1950s, 1960s, almost killed him. It would be that type of a thing. It knocked him down, blinded him in one eye, and almost killed him, a baseball. These sling stones go at about 150 miles an hour. And so he got hit right in the face, and then David went over and decapitated him and took his head. Now, something they don't talk about, here's a Strozzi. It shows David with the head of Goliath. This is in the Cincinnati Art Museum, and my wife, as a docent, often lectured on this. And it shows David with the head of Goliath and the stone embedded in the forehead. And in one of her classes, she had some young children, and she said, does anybody know what this story might be? And the little fellow raised his hand and said, I know. He said, it's Jack and the Beanstalk. But here's another one, and I think this is just wonderful. It says, David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem. And here is a painting by Conigliano. It shows David walking with Jonathan and carrying the head of Goliath. And if you take a look at Goliath's expression, you can tell he wasn't pleased. I think it's... But it says that David took the head back to Jerusalem, and Golgotha, the place where Christ was crucified, means the hill of the skull. And there are those that would argue that Golgotha is where the head of Goliath was buried, and it later became an execution field. So anyway, for what it's worth, that's David and Goliath. Now it says the Philistines fought against Israel during the time of David and Goliath. Later on, 15 years later, Israel and the Philistines had a major battle, and Saul was killed. It says the archers overtook him, wounded him critically. Saul took his own sword and fell on it. David had been driven out of Israel during those 15 years. He had been taken into Saul's household, was raised as a warrior, and then had a falling out and had to flee. And after this particular battle, David was able to return to Israel and was eventually acclaimed king by the people after Saul died. And then we have all the stories of David. He was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. And we have the various stories that are associated there. And then when he died, Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his rule was firmly established. And in every sense of the word, firmly established is true. Solomon betrayed the Lord. It says that the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream and said, ask for whatever you want me to give you. This was right after Solomon took the throne. The best way that you can calculate his age is that he was probably in his young 20s. His older brothers were in their late 30s, but with Bathsheba, David had fathered 2 children. The first one died, and then Solomon was the second child. And Solomon was given the opportunity to request something of the Lord, and what he asked for was a discerning heart and the ability to distinguish between right and wrong. And the Lord was so pleased with that request that he was highly successful for most of his life. And if you read the book of Chronicles, that's where it stops. Solomon was very successful and died. But if you read the book of Kings, you find that Solomon fell. He betrayed the Lord, he went to pagan worship, and he brought about the division of the kingdom and the destruction of Israel. And we never talk about that. I've always been a little bit curious about why we tend to overlook the terrible betrayal by Solomon. But the Bible points out that when Solomon had achieved all he had desired to do, the Lord appeared to him a second time, and again told him that you will be highly successful as long as you follow my way. Well, Solomon didn't. Unfortunately, he betrayed the Lord. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. Most of these are not wives with whom he had relations. These would have been younger women, children of warlords around the area that were sent, and they were in a harem. And not only that, it says as he grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods. He betrayed the Lord. He actually abandoned his faith. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. Moloch was a god that demanded child sacrifice. Solomon became a follower of that god. It says he followed Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites, and you would actually sacrifice little children. They'd roll screaming into the flaming arms of Moloch. So that was what Solomon did, and unfortunately it says the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. God didn't appear to very many people in the Bible. Solomon, in his dreams, now he actually appeared to a few people, but he appeared in the dreams of Solomon, and Solomon betrayed him. And the Lord said, since you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, I'll tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. And this is what happened. Now, I have a big question as to how this played out. I don't know why the kingdom wasn't taken from Solomon at the time he was allowed to live out his life. And then the kingdom was divided. But we hear that for the sake of David, your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I'll tear it out of the hand of your son. And so his son, unfortunately, had to deal with the breakdown of the kingdom, but his son was a pagan worshiper as well. And we have all these terrible betrayals. And it says Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years. Then he rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, his father. And I can show you here where that was done. This is a fairly good rendering of the city of Jerusalem. It was a long, narrow city that kind of stepped down from the temple to the lower end. And in that particular area right there, we have the ancient tombs when the kings were actually still buried in the city. Later on, they moved the tombs outside of the city because they felt it was a corruption. But at the time, we have what's left of the tombs, and Solomon and David were probably buried. It's all been dug away and destroyed, but this is an area in the city of Jerusalem, if any of you have gone to the old city. And it goes on and says, Rehoboam, his son, succeeded him as king. So that's where we are. We're going to start with that next week, and you're not going to want to miss it. It's the division of the kingdom. It's divided into two parts. It went into a major decline. Enemies developed all around it. It's eventually the Assyrians and finally the Babylonians, and destroyed the city, carried the remnant back off into exile, and then they returned. Unfortunately, it was never an independent kingdom again until 1948. So that's it. Next week we're going to talk about the progression. You don't want to miss it. And I have just a couple of minutes for some questions if anybody's curious about something or wants to. Yes?
What's your opinion on Solomon, whether you think he made it into heaven or not?
This is a history class, and I have no answer for that. I'm sorry. It was a huge betrayal. Moloch was one of the worst of the gods that accepted child sacrifice. This was a terrible betrayal. And the Book of Chronicles, which is kind of Book of Chronicles was written during the Babylonian exile. The Book of Kings was written sequentially as the kings lived. And that's the one that presents the betrayal of Solomon. The Book of Chronicles doesn't mention it at all, and it's written after they returned. And so it's kind of a sanitized version, I think, of the things that happened with Solomon. And so I don't know how to interpret that. But the betrayal is made very clear, and they completely omit it in the Book of Chronicles.